kind of adjust as we go along. I've asked if we can get some water onto the tables for you during the morning tea break, so if you're a bit dry, hang on, that'll come. And now though, can I introduce Phil and Brooke from Pathways. Please welcome them.
I talk about price at every meeting I go to, and I can hardly get out the door before somebody hits me on the back of the head. So I'm not going to talk about price. What I might say though, in terms of the video that we just watched, it was fantastic to see the testimonials of consumers and some carers. I suppose the context of that is that we're giving those testimonials from a Barwon perspective, where Barwon providers have been effectively what's called in kind. We sometimes call it unkind, but it's in kind. So we're being block funded while still administering the plans. And the consequence of that, I think, is that providers have maintained their workforce, their experienced and quality workforce. And so those people are delivering those supports. I worry we won't be able to maintain that quality workforce, and the experience of consumers potentially may change as a consequence. So I've been asked to give you really a bit of a synopsis of the organisational change issues associated with the transition in Barwon. That cartoon is about right. I think the transition came upon providers in Barwon pretty quickly. Just the context, and I'm rushing through this is about a 45-minute presentation I'm going to do in 10. So the context really is, for Pathways, is a typical mental health provider. We do outreach, we run groups, we have a FAMS program with an employment focus, and Pathways also runs an ADE, really providing employment for people with a lived experience of mental illness and recovery. That's 70 to 80 people. We have 270, 280 thereabouts, people with that NDIS plan at the moment, who had transitioned from March 2014. We also have had other people who were found ineligible that we continue to support up to the end of the in-kind period in July next year. In the beginning it wasn't good, to be honest, but I won't labour on this. It was quite a difficult experience for all providers. The pace of change was unbelievable. We weren't really, as Laura alluded to, engaged by the NDIA as key or valued stakeholders in the process. Many service users were ill-prepared, confused and distressed, and that's partly our responsibility, but I also think it's partly the pace of change was just too quick. The scheme was very immature, and the NDIA, good people, doing a very complex thing for the first time themselves, and providers trying to interface with that with a very immature scheme was difficult. The transitioning costs were immense, in fact, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, to actually adapt across the whole provider network. And the IT difficulties were an absolute nightmare and continue to be. Workforce preparedness and response, very immature at the start, but it's been evolving. As Laura alluded to, it's improving every day. We're now less of an enemy. In the beginning we were sort of considered people with a vested interest who had been administering a failed system for 15 years. So you can imagine the dynamic in the room is quite strange at times. But now the NDIA, peak bodies, consumer and carer groups and peak bodies are establishing working groups and a whole range of processes which are starting to critique, I suppose, the scheme and its implications for mental health. Greater clarity every day about definitions and processes, but the inconsistency in the outcomes for clients remain a major problem. And also, obviously, providers have adapted, but there are still many pieces of the puzzle remaining. In fact, I'm talking about our learnings, but we're still on a very steep learning curve. So I've tried to break my presentation into sort of phases, I suppose. So from a pre-rollout point of view, from an organisational change I'd very much encourage you to get your data systems sorted out if they're not already. And having met with a lot of individual providers, there's sort of almost a train every day. It comes down to Barwon and meets with the whole range of providers that are there. Many of you are actually quite well prepared for the scheme. But you really need to look at your data system and see whether it's connected to your rostering system and your financial system. Really, there needs to be a process whereby once you get a plan, you can input the details of that plan into your database that tracks the delivery of that plan into your invoicing and reconciliation process whereby you can send the NDIS bill. If you haven't got that, you're going to spend hours and hours and hours trying to track the process and understand it. And of course, that database, which I'll go into a little bit later, will also help you monitor targets and a whole range of other workforce issues. One thing it's not up on the slide, but one thing that you should also try to figure out now is does your system allow verification of service delivery? Not to show your staff member went out, but in fact, does the consumer or the person who's receiving that service have an opportunity to confirm that the service was delivered? Because effectively that's what the NDIA wants. Financial modelling, I'm sure you're all doing this now. Can you afford to actually deliver the services you're currently delivering in the way you're doing it? After hours, weekends, what sort of services, how many people are involved? Obviously Laura she mentioned the sort of price catalogue. When you average that price out, taking into account that you only get paid face to face, the numbers aren't great. So you need to really look at your financial situation and against your contractual arrangements with your workforce, what you're paying them, what they're prepared to work, and see where the numbers stack up. Importantly, and I think many of you have done this already, I'm very conscious that the recommissioning process was a major significant change for all of you, so it's not like some of this stuff is just related to Barwon and the NDIA experience. But certainly with the NDIA, you need to be very clear on your practice principles, your vision and mission, your customer service focus, what makes you unique. You also need to be very conscious of your agility and the scope of the service. Do you want to focus in on particular things, or do you just want to continue to do the stuff we're doing? And of course, the bigger issue is diversity. NDIA may not necessarily pay the bills. You may need to have a whole range of service options. Marketing and branding, again, Laura talked about, and the video very much made the point that people are looking for information about what providers provide and what makes them unique. So you need to look at your marketing and your branding, in particular your website. Does it match the NDIA context and how you wish to portray what you do? Laura also mentioned the service agreement. It's a piece of work you need to be doing now, potentially with lawyers. You need to look at what you need to have in that service agreement and get that ready to go so that when you get your first plan and your rollout, you've got a mechanism and a process and a contract that you can that can help you interface with the client. Of course, what we struggle with is the lawyers told us to put together a 10-page contract that sort of dealt with everything. And of course, it's very legalistic. So you're trying to have a conversation with somebody when they've chosen you, and yet they're very intimidated, but you all would be, when given a 10-page document. So it's changed about 4 times, I think, since we started, but it still is pretty legalistic in some respects. So it's a matter of trying to reassure the service user that this is just a means to an end, and try to interpret those things for people who struggle to understand it. You also need to develop now, pre-rollout, a transition action plan. What extra resources do you think you're going to need? And I can't go into the detail of that in a short period of time. Very happy to talk to anybody about that at any later So pre-transition, this is something that our learnings aren't necessarily from what we did right, it's actually from what we didn't do right, or what we could have done better. And this was a mistake of ours. Our data system wasn't as clean as it should have been. So we had people on our system that, had just left us and we hadn't taken them off, or we thought they'd be coming back soon, so we left them on a particular element of our data system. So the NDIA will send you a letter through rollout, and they'll say, give us information on every client you've got and all their demographic detail. And you don't seek consent, you have to give it to them. Now, if you give it to them, and there are people on that list that shouldn't be on that list, the NDIA legally applies to use that original list to track your transition. So they'll be contacting people that aren't in contact with you multiple times to ask them to test their eligibility. And then they'll be communicating with you that their data system and your data system doesn't match. So I think it's really important that you go through your data system and make sure that the contact details in your active list is very accurate. Establish clear communication liaison arrangements with local NDIA reps. When they are established in your rollout areas, we certainly attempted to have many conversations with our NDIA colleagues about, we're in this together, let's work on these sorts of things together. And to be frank, in Barwon, that was quite difficult in the beginning, but I think the NDIA has now learned from the Barwon experience, and no doubt other launch sites across the nation, and hopefully we're looking to collaborate with you about the sort of local circumstances and what sort of things they need to take into account when they're trying to transition the clients that we currently serve. Hopefully ILC will be in place. It wasn't in Barwon, and it's still unclear, as Laura said, what that looks like. But hopefully that will, in many of the rollout areas, give an opportunity to establish good communication processes and maybe a better awareness about the scheme. This is another thing I think we certainly learned. Laura again mentioned about sort of eligibility, diagnosis issues, GPs, clinical services, private psychiatrists, a whole range of other agencies. I think pre your rollout, certainly pre-transition, it would be great to sort of link and liaise with all of those individuals and say, look, this is coming, this is what we think we'll need to do together in terms of information. Like, you can imagine that some of your clients actually aren't connected to the clinical system. Probably saw a private psychiatrist 15 years ago and haven't seen a psychiatrist maybe for 5 years. Now, unfortunately, the reality was, in our experience, that a diagnosis was required. And it couldn't just come from a GP. If it came from a GP, they had to refer to evidence from a psychiatrist. So often you had a situation where clients would have to go back to bookings and see the psychiatrist, try to get back into the public system to see a psychiatrist. I hope there's no psychiatrist in the room, but can you imagine 40 or 50 letters being written in a week? That's not going to happen. So you really need to liaise with all of those people and say, look, what can we do to make sure we can streamline this? Because it was very distressing for people to have to go back, pay to see somebody often, wait, then find somebody who didn't particularly know what was required. Often psychiatrists didn't want to actually say this was a permanent disability, which is fair enough. And so they had to go back again and all of that. So it's really good, I think, to have all those conversations before your transition starts. Clearly, you've got an opportunity now, with the knowledge that we're now having the transition with Barwon and elsewhere, to really put a lot of effort into linking with this current service users and helping them understand the process. The process for eligibility is a deficit-based process, effectively. I think that's improving in terms of the narrative and the way the NDIA workers collaborate and liaise with service users, but they still in effect have to prove how bad they are on their worst day. And this is a conversation that some people find very difficult to have. So preparing your service users to understand that almost like it's a means to an end. I think this could be useful and will diminish their distress. Now, of course, I know there's talk about your current service users in the rollout in Victoria being deemed eligible, so they may not have to go through a process like that. That would be fantastic if that happens. But the eligibility process is quite a distressing one for many clients. Develop a consistent communication brief for your workers for service user discussion. You can imagine the misinformation that occurred, and often workers had a particular view about the morality or ethics or the legitimacy of the scheme, and that would come out in the way that they would talk, certainly in our experience, the way that they would talk with service users. So you need to work with your current staff and say, look, this is what it is, this is the way we're going to communicate it, this has to be consistent, and so that all service users get a very clear and consistent view. And you can do that with a range of things. Using peers, obviously, and we're going to hear from peer workers and consumers throughout the day. Using them to communicate those messages, I think, would be very powerful. Both for your current service users and also your staff, understanding the context of the scheme, the legislation, the principles behind it, all of those things, I think, is really, this is the time that you need to do that with the staff. So when your transition starts, there's not confusion about where's this scheme come from, what's the basis of it. People understand and have time to digest it. I think that's very important. Yep. Okay. Well, potential 3 minutes. Okay. Pre-transition. I haven't even got the transition yet. Pre-transition. So, support of existing service users. Now, service users, again in the transition, we weren't really involved in the eligibility and planning process unless we sort of muscled in on that. But recently, with new service users coming into the scheme and choosing providers, they're much more open to our support and the support of other advocates. But with your existing service users, I think it's really important to link the liaison you've had with your NDIA people about what information they need, and then put that to the service users and say, how can we help you gather this information? Whether it's the diagnosis, whether it's your recovery star or anything else that you're using, whether it's a sort of document from the carer or other providers, all of those things I think would be useful so that when they go to the eligibility and subsequently the planning process, they feel empowered, they feel like they've got all their information, they've been given an opportunity to think about what they need. One thing, because of the pace of change in Barwon, we made a mistake by actually giving them our documentation and saying, this is what you do with us. Because basically they took that to the NDIA planning process and in the main basically got that replicated to some extent. It was a lost opportunity for our service users to think outside their current situation. And so obviously we've been doing reviews after 12 months and we've prepared our service users a lot more for the great opportunity of thinking about after hours, a whole range of other new goals and objectives they might have in their life. Workforce. I've mentioned already about sort of staff education, about the legislation and principles, the language and definitions. The language is quite different. Participants is obviously the new part of the new language. Also, really trying to inform staff about the ethics and morality and the sort of worldwide momentum around disability care and how that's driving the NDIA. People need to understand that the background to the NDIA is obviously fantastic. So that when they are in it and they're facing all those challenges and opportunities, they can keep sight of it. You need to consider the additional workloads, the manage the communication. That's part of really your transition action plan. And I think Brooke later on today is going to talk about the impact on workers, so I won't labour on that. neither will I over on this. Staff professional and emotional support. Brooke will talk more about that. In terms of workforce, in terms of an organisational issue, you need to consider whether your workforce structures, classifications, your supervision arrangements and all of those things match what you are now going to propose as your service response. For example, we recontracted all of our staff to reaffirm the 7-day nature of our service and after hours. It's there in the award, but we recontracted them to sort of reaffirm that. So you need to think about those things, because it basically flagged with our staff that our services don't much. We have a 7-day-a-week service prior to the NDIA, but on a minimal basis. Now it's basically a 7-day-a-week service. I'll finish in a moment. So you also need to think about targets. Greater clarity about documentation requirements. You know, we have a 5-minute rule for documentation, basically. The supervision formality, you'll have less opportunity with your staff for them to have supervision or ad hoc debriefing with their colleagues. So you really need to understand how to make sure they provide an adequate opportunity for supervision and support. Recruitment is, you know, you probably thought about this, casual versus permanent. Of course, in the trial period, it was very difficult to understand where the sort of bedrock was going to end up, really, in terms of the workforce that was required. Obviously, if you're going 7 days a week, you're more likely to have a lot more part-time staff, casual staff. We basically employed casual staff at a greater rate. And once we had established a consistent work activity level, then we would offer opportunities for more permanent part-time. And so we just kept tweaking up. That worked for us, may not work for you. So hopefully you should expect all of these things that are up on the screen, which I mentioned. And that's the end of that. Sorry, that was a rush.